Hi, my name is Stewart Lynch, and in this video I'm going to walk you through a process for creating a login view for your app that includes some design work, MVVM, and field validation using Combine. Now before I get started, let me request that if you enjoy this video, please leave a comment below and give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. Make sure you ring the bell to be notified of new videos, and if you want to support my work, you can buy me a coffee. If this is something you want to learn, then keep watching. Now, some time ago I created this video, and the focus was on learning how to validate data entry in SwiftUI. Throughout the process, we learned about MVVM design pattern and used regular expressions to validate the data entry. In the video, my starter project's login view was already designed, and the focus was on the MVVM and SwiftUI and regular expressions to validate the field entries. This time, I'm going to build the same app, but will first take you through the process of how I designed the UI before going into the field validation portion of the video. Now, if all you're interested in is the combined field validation part of the video, then please feel free to jump to that portion. I have a link in the description below for that. And you can also download the completed part 1 of this video, so you don't need to do the design work for the login screen if you choose not to. Now before I start my video, I'd also like to point out that you should always check out different references on the same topic. For example, Tundsdev has an excellent video on this same topic, but he takes a slightly different approach. Please check his video out too, and I'll leave a link in the notes below. Now on to my video. The starter project this time is very basic. I'll leave a link in the notes below if you want to start there, or you could just add this code to a new project of your own. I have 4 string variables decorated with the @state property wrapper, and these are all bound to 4 different text fields, 2 of which are secure fields to obfuscate the text being entered, along with a button for sign up. I haven't entered any action at all yet, as that would depend on your app. They are embedded in a VStack with some padding, but this is basically a prototype. What we want to do is to improve this design. Here's our completed app, where you see that I've added some icons to the first 3 fields and added a style to the button. The year of birth is no longer a text field, but rather a button that, when tapped, presents a scrolling list of years for which to pick the birth year. When I enter values into the text fields or select a birth year, I'm not allowed to sign up until I have satisfied the validation requirements. And note also that there is prompt text that will disappear once the criteria has been met. What I'm not going to do in this video is show you how you might want to present this screen and move to a successful login screen in your app. If you're interested in that process, I recommend that you watch this video where I go over the login screen workflow and talk about biometric authentication as well in the second of the videos in this 2-part series. So let's get started. The first thing I'm going to do is to start by creating a file for our view model. And this is how we separate the logic from our UI. So we'll create a Swift file called login view model. And inside that file, I'll create a class with the same name, but make sure that it conforms to the observable object protocol. I'm going to return to content view now and cut out all of those 4 properties, and I'm going to paste them into the view model. I need to remove the @state property wrapper along with the private designation, and instead specify that they are marked with an @published property wrapper. Returning now to content view, there are errors, so we need to create an @state object that will initialize an instance of our new view model, and we can call that property view model. With that now defined, we can reference that instance of our view model to access the bound published string properties. Now, while we're at it, the action that we'll have to process your credentials and log in should be a function in the view model. So for example, let's create a new function in login view model and I'll call it login. And for the content, I'll just enter some statement like this. Now within the button for signing up, we can call the viewModels function for the action. Okay, nothing has changed yet with respect to our design. Now the first thing I want to do is to create the design for our first 3 fields. And what I want here are new views that are composed of an H stack containing an SF image and either a text field or a secure field with a placeholder. So the design is basically the same for all 3, it's just the content that's different. So what I'm going to do is create a new SwiftUI file, and I'm going to call it entry field. Now this view is going to have 4 different variables to specify the SF symbol name, a placeholder string, whether or not the field is secure or not, and eventually a prompt. So let me create those first. And I'll make the isSecure property default to false, so I only have to specify it if I want my field to be a secure field. Now, additionally, we'll need to pass in a binding to our field content, which is a string, and I'm going to place it before the isSecure entry. Now this invalidates our preview, so we'll need to create some sample values for our property so that we can see the design take place. So let's enter envelope for the SF symbol name. For the placeholder, I'll enter email address, and the prompt can be enter a valid email address. And then for the field, I'll just use a constant empty string. Well, now we can design. We'll start first with an H stack. And there'll be 2 views, one which will be an SF symbol, and the other will be a secure field or a text field depending on the value of isSecure. So first the image. We'll use the image with a system name of our passed in SF symbol name, and then we'll set a foreground color to gray and change the font to a heading. Now I also want the images and the placeholders to line up, so I'll set a fixed frame of a width of 20 on our image. The second item in the H stack is either going to be a secure field or a text field, depending on whether or not isSecure is true. If isSecure is true, we'll present the secure field using our placeholder and bound to our field. Else, we'll just present a plain text field using the same placeholder and field binding. Then, to ensure that the first letter is not capitalized, I'll set auto capitalization to none on both by setting it on the H stack. Let's add some padding of, say, 8. Then I'll set the background to a secondary system background color. And then I'll place an overlay of a rounded rectangle with a corner radius of 8 and a stroke of a color gray with a line width of 1. This makes it much more clear as a text entry. For the prompt, I'm going to embed the H stack in a V stack with a leading alignment. And then as the second entry, I can create the text view using our prompt. I'll set it to a fixed size with the horizontal being false but vertical being true, and set the font to caption. And this will ensure that our prompt text will wrap as required. If we return now to Content View, we can replace our 3 fields with these new entry field types. And in each case, we'll just leave the prompt as an empty string, and we'll fix that up later. So first the email field using a symbol of envelope with the placeholder email address and bound to our viewModels email property. For the two password fields, I'm going to use a lock symbol, and I'll set the placeholder in the first one to password, and I'll bind it to the viewModel's password property, but I'll also need to set the isSecure to true. The confirm password entry field is handled similarly. Let's now design our year picker. I'll create another SwiftUI view that I'll call Year Picker View. Now, this view is going to overlay our login view when we tap on the Year button. And we're going to select a year from a scrolling list. This means that we're going to have two bound properties, one for the birth year and another for the state of showing the view. So we'll create both as bindings. Birth year being an int and show year selector being a Boolean property. Now, to stop our preview from complaining, let's just use bindings to constant values and pick a birth year of, say, 1993 and set the show year selector to true. Now, our list will present 100 years back from the current year. So we'll need to find out what the current year is, because that's going to change. We can't hard code it. And we're going to use that in several places. So this is a good place to create a constant. And I'm going to create a new file called constants. And inside that file, I just create an enum called constants. And I can use that as a namespace for all of the constants that I'm going to use. I'm actually only going to have one, but I still want to have a constants file. So inside the enum, I'll create a static let property that will determine the current year. And it can be found by using the calendar.currentDate components, using the year component from the currentDate.year, and we can safely unwrap that. Returning now to the year picker view, this view will be on top of our login view, blocking access to the view that's behind it until we select the year and dismiss this overlay. And we can do this by creating a Z stack or a Z stack, and as the first item of the Z stack, create a color view of a black color, but with an opacity of 0.4, ignoring all safe areas. So this will overlay the entire view behind it, blocking access. Now, on top of that, as the second item of the Z stack, we'll place a V stack, and inside there a scroll view, and we want to indicate that we don't want to show any indicators. Now, inside the scroll view, I'll create another V stack with a spacing of 10. And now we can iterate with a for each loop starting at the current year minus 100, stepping up to the current year. And we're using our constant here, so it's easier to read. But we also want to reverse so that it starts from the current year backwards. And because we're in a for each loop, we'll need to specify an ID. And since they are unique, we can just use .self. The year then becomes our iterator, so inside we can create a button. For the label, we'll use the string representation of the year for the text view and set the foreground color to primary. If we used a string interpolation of the integer, I'd see 1,000 separator, which is a comma in North America, so using string year will prevent that. For the action, we can set the birth year to the selected year, and then use an ease-in animation to dismiss the view by setting the show year selector to false. Next, I'll set the scroll view's frame height to 200 I'll add some padding to the V-stack and set a frame with a width of 100. I'm going to specify a background to a color of secondary system background, and then add another clip shape of a rounded rectangle with a corner radius of 30 and continuous style corners. And then finally, to make it pop out a bit, I'll add a shadow color of black with an opacity of 2 and a radius of 20 with 0 at X and 20 for Y. Now I'm going to embed this picker's V-stack in another V-stack, and then finally add a spacer to push it up to the top. So let's put it to use. Back in our view model, we need a way to toggle this view, so let's add a new property to our view model, and we'll call it Show Year Selector, and set it initially to false. In Content View, I'll change the birth year text field now to a button, using our birth year as the label, and the action will set our new Show Year Selector to true. My birth year, however, is no longer a string, and it needs to be an int. And if we want to write the initial year, it has to be set to the current year. So back in the login view model, we'll need to set it to the current year, and for that we can use our constants current year. Our label for our button then is the string representation of that view model's property. The action will simply assign the Show Year Selector property to true, and we can do that with another ease in with animation block to smoothly transition the change. Let's embed this V-stack now inside of a Z-stack. And then, as the second item in the Z-stack, we can add our year picker view. And we'll pass in our view model's birth year and Show Year Selector for the bound properties. Now, we only want this view to be visible if Show Year Selector is true. And we can do that by setting the opacity of our picker based on the state of that property. So an opacity of 1 if it's true, or 0 if it's false. Let's test to see what we've got so far. And I see I get a nice animation to select our picker, and I can select our birth year. Let's add some more design elements to our view though, so we can make it pop up a little bit better. For the sign up button, I'm going to set the foreground color to white. I'll add a vertical padding of 5. I'll add some horizontal padding. And then I'm going to set the background as a capsule with a fill of color blue. Now there's always more than one way to design buttons in SwiftUI. This just happens to be one that I like. Let's customize this form sum to make it pop out. First, I'm going to remove this spacer because it's going to get placed somewhere else. And I'm going to embed this V-stack inside another V-stack. After the padding, I'll add a background of a color that is system background. And then I'm going to use a clip shape that's a rounded rectangle with a corner radius of 30 and a continuous style. And then I'll follow that again with a shadow using a color that is black with an opacity of 0.2 and again a radius of 20, but only in the Y direction. I can now add back that spacer to push it back up again to the top. Then on the entire V-stack, I'll add some padding before the year picker view. Oh, one more thing. Let's stylize that button for the year. Currently, it's not obvious as a button, so let's do something about that. First, I'll create a padding of 8 all around. I'll set the foreground color to primary, a background color that is a secondary system background, and then I'll overlay a rounded rectangle with a corner radius of 8, a stroke that's a color gray with a line width of 1. Let's test this in the simulator now. It's looking great in both light and dark modes because we've used semantic colors. When you tap on a birth year button, access to the view and behind is blocked until we select a year, which then populates that button's title and sets the opacity back to 0, displaying the background view. Finally, now we get to the point where we can validate our field entries. Our form has been designed. As I mentioned at the outset, if you didn't follow along with Part 1, you can download the completed Part 1 version of this project from the link in the notes below. All of our coding now is going to happen within the view model. But first, remember that we've left spaces for prompts below our text fields, and we still need to add one below our date field, and I'll get to that shortly. In the first video on this topic, I didn't use combine. However, combine is an ideal solution here for evaluating data and responding to changes in a text or secure field entry. And what we want to do is to determine, based on that entry, if the field is a valid field based on some kind of criteria that we've set. So let's create 5 published Boolean validation properties that we'll set to false initially. One is for is email criteria valid? So let's do that and initialize it as false. I'm going to copy this and paste it 4 more times so that I can rename the properties. They'll all be set to false. First one is password criteria valid? Is password confirm valid? Is age valid? And then finally one that will evaluate whether all of them are true and set a can submit property, which initially is false. Now, to evaluate whether or not our email or password is valid, I have to have some kind of criteria. And I'm going to use regular expressions to evaluate that criteria. We'll be able to evaluate our string based on a predicate where the format uses a regular expression. So we'll create a constant called email predicate, and it's an NS predicate where the format is self matches %A. And we'll need to find a suitable regular expression for the string replacement. Now, if you're unclear on NS predicate with formats and arguments, please refer to this video that I have created. I'll leave a link in the description below. So let's just copy and change the second one to password predicate, where we can find a suitable regex expression that will help us here as well. Now, teaching you about regular expressions is beyond the scope of this tutorial. I went over this in that first video about how to use a website to find regular expressions that I could use. Unfortunately, that site is no longer available. You can, however, Google for evaluating email by regular expressions and finding suitable password restrictions. There are lots of examples. For example, if I Google regex email validation, I see that there's one here that stands out that says it works 99.99% of the time. Well, that seems good to me. So let me go there. Let me copy and paste this regular expression, and I'll paste it into as our string argument. And I see that I get an error. And that's because our regular expression uses a backslash, and it also has some single quotes. And I can't have that in my string, so I'll need to escape both the backslash and the quote character. Now I can go through here and try and find them all, but I'll likely miss them. So what I like to do is to copy this and paste it into any text editor and use the text editor's find and replace capabilities. So let me open up text edit and paste it in here. First, I'll find and replace the backslash with backslash backslash. Then I'll replace the single quote with backslash single quote. After doing that, I can copy the edited version and paste this new regex as a string replacement in our variable. I also want to find one now, a regular expression that will enforce good password habits. So let me search for regex password validation. The first entry here is a Stack Overflow question and answer, so let's go there. You see all sorts of suggestions in the answers. So let's just go and pick an easy one, this one here, that will check for a minimum of 8 characters with at least one letter, one number, and one special character. I'm just going to copy and paste that in to my property right now. There are 2 backslashes that I need to escape, so I can do that without having to paste into a text editor. Well, now that we have these constants, we can set up subscribers to our published properties and use combine to map and evaluate the entry as it comes in. And if we're using combine and subscriptions and we want those subscriptions to survive, we'll have to store them in a set of any cancelable. But first, we'll need to import combine. And now I can create a private variable called cancelable set, and I'll just initialize it as an empty set of any cancelable. We can now create our subscriptions to our published properties, and we'll do that within our class's initializer. Our publishers will evaluate incoming streams and assign the result or the evaluated result to our new published Boolean properties. So it's either going to be a true or a false. So first for email, we'll map the incoming stream of string, and I'll call it email, and then I'll return whether or not our regular expression email predicate evaluates with that email. So it'll evaluate either as true or false, and we'll need to use self as we're in a closure here in the stream of text. And then we can assign that result to the isEmailCriteriaValid property on self. And then we'll need to store that in our cancelable set so that it survives. Well, let me just copy and paste this as their password validation is going to be similar. We'll change the publisher to password and evaluate the stream of text in the password field against the password predicate and assign the result to the isPasswordCriteriaValid property. The birth year, we don't need to use any predicate. All we need to do is return whether or not the current year minus our birth year is greater than or equal to 21. That's our target age. It's either going to be true or false, and we'll assign that to isAgeValid. Great, that takes care of our first 3 view validation properties. But what about the other 2? Well, for isPasswordConfirmValid, we can use a combine publisher's combine latest method and evaluate both of the inputs from password and confirm password and return whether or not they are equal. and then assign that Boolean value to the isPasswordConfirmedValid. And then finally, to evaluate whether or not we can submit our request for logging in, I'll need to evaluate the status of all of the other 4 and return the status of whether or not all 4 are true. So publishers.combineLatest4 this time on is email criteria valid, is password criteria valid, is password confirmed valid, and is age valid publishers. We'll then map those inputs to Boolean values of the same name, and then evaluate using the compound and comparing all 4. We can then assign that to canSubmit, and as always, store the subscription. The only thing left we have to do now is to create some computed properties that will display the correct prompts based on the status of our validation properties. So the first one I'll call confirm password prompt. And I'm going to use the ternary operator based on is password confirmed valid. So I will return an empty string if not, else I'll return password fields do not match. So for the other 3, I'll just copy and paste this 3 more times, and I'll fix this typo here. Now for the first one, we'll call email prompt based on is email criteria valid. It's an empty string if it is, else we'll say enter a valid email address. For the password prompt, it'll be based on is password criteria valid. Again, an empty string if it is, otherwise we'll say it must be at least 8 characters containing at least 1 number, 1 letter, and 1 special character. And then finally for the age prompt, it'll be based on is age valid, but we don't want an empty string initially, we want it to say year of birth. Now, if it's not matching 21 years or less, we'll have to say year of birth must be 21 years old. And one last thing. Once we've successfully logged in, we can reset our email, password, and confirm passwords back to empty strings, and then set the birth year back to the current year using our constant. We now have everything we need. Returning now to Content View, the first thing I'm going to do is disable and lower the opacity of that sign up button based on the value of our ViewModel's canSubmit property. So if it's true, we'll have the opacity set to 1. Otherwise, it'll be set to 0.6. And we might as well disable it if not ViewModel canSubmit. That gives us a great visual clue. For the entry fields now, we can pass in our corresponding computed prompt properties, because remember we left those as empty strings. So we can pass now in the ViewModel's email prompt, the ViewModel's password prompt, and the ViewModel's confirm password prompt. Now finally, we'll need to add our birth year prompt. So to do this, we'll embed the birth year button in another VStack. And then as the second item, we'll add a text view using the ViewModel age prompt. with a caption font. That's it. Let's test. We see initially now, because our criteria is not met anywhere, we see our password prompts displayed. As I start entering an email address, nothing changes until it's evaluated as a valid email and the prompt disappears. The password, I need to make sure that it's at least 8 characters with 1 number, 1 letter, and 1 special character. As soon as that criteria is met, the prompt disappears. But we still need to confirm that password. So we're having a prompt to tell us that it's not matching. As soon as we enter the same password, the prompt disappears. Our button still is disabled with a lower opacity. I'll need to pick a birth year that would make me older than 21. When I do that, all prompts have been removed and my button is now active at full opacity. When I tap on the button, the action of my ViewModels login function gets executed, which normally would take me to the next step, but in my case, it's just going to print out logging in slynch@createxall.com, and then it clears my text fields and resets the birth year back to the current year. Fantastic. We're done. I hope you've enjoyed this video and learned something about field validation, Combine, the MVVM design pattern, and just some design practical code. Thanks for watching.